Going into the future, I'm going to keep the Facts and Logic report kind of a shorter segment. I wanted to do the marathon this episode. It's the catch up episode, but I really would rather focus on longer stories rather than just spewing out a bunch at the beginning. It works for Democracy Now!, but I don't release as frequently as Democracy Now! So, with the first major story I'm going to talk about, it's about the Covexidus. Ooh.
My bum is on the cheese! Bum is on the cheese! If I get lucky, I'll get a disease!
So, and by Covexidus, I mean, a combination of COVID-19 and Exodus, because what is going on is there is a mass exodus from several cities in several countries. Some of these reasons are directly related to coronavirus, some are partially, but we're going to talk about that. So there's been a mass exodus from the capital of Bangladesh, Dhaka, as the economic impact of COVID-19 is forcing Bangladeshis to flee cities. So I want to start focusing on Bangladesh because that you may have been hearing about this in American press about American cities, but we don't often hear about things like this for a place like Bangladesh. So I'm going to talk about the situation there, compare it to the United States, and then some other countries, and see what conclusions we can draw from the fact that many people are leaving cities and COVID is a big part. So, poor Dhakkaites, people who live in Dhaka, have basically no social safety net. Bangladeshi workers, especially in the clothing sector, were forced back to work with little protection. The government launched aid programs to sustain the poor during lockdown, but did not reach urban slum populations, which is what needed it the most. Because a lot of people living in these urban slums are actually migrant workers. Usually, they come from elsewhere, usually rural parts of Bangladesh. So as Dhaka starts emptying out, especially these urban poor, villages are filling up, and most people returning out to the countryside will try to get agricultural work, but it's not guaranteed because these villages aren't really designed for a mass amount of workers to flood into their markets. Many left their villages in the first place because making a living from the land had become impossible. And on top of all of this, the effects of climate change, which, includes land erosion, the infiltration of salty water into previously arable land. All of this stuff has forced millions to abandon their native homes in rural parts of Bangladesh. Bangladesh, along with maybe Indonesia, I'm sure there's other countries too, but Bangladesh is one of the earliest and most deeply affected countries from climate change, due in large parts to the country being such low altitude and frequently flooding. Dhaka was underwater when I was reading about this a few weeks ago. And Dhaka is basically built at the delta of a massive river. It's all, half the country's floodplains. So let's not just talk about Bangladesh. The exodus from major cities is not just unique to there, it's also happening here in the United States. San Francisco Chronicle reported in June that 1 out of 13 renters in San Francisco broke their lease since COVID started. And let me be clear, that doesn't mean unpaid rent, because that if someone wasn't paying their rent, it would mean they're still abiding by the lease. They're just not fulfilling their end of the lease. But if you break your lease, that entails that you're moving, most likely.
Take a ride with the dogs tonight in suburbia.
And similarly, throughout June and into July, there were several articles about how people are moving out of New York City. There's also been a lot of articles about how people are leaving cities like New York because of crime. That's a right-wing talking point. I don't think that's actually true. It may be true. Like, I always joke that a lot of U.S. cities are one thrown brick away from people moving out to the suburbs. Like, in any city, you have one brick thrown through a window, and at least one person's like, okay, we're moving out now. I don't think crime is actually contributing as much as COVID, because COVID actually has an economic impact, whereas crime, I mean, it does have an economic impact, but it's not systemic, obviously. And that's just their way to tie the protest movement going on into crime. So
Democrats decided to shield and shelter criminal. Look, wait. You have criminals.
but there was recently a report from New York City that
Welcome to New York.
there's 67,000 empty units in the city, and rent in those available units are down 9% from the same time last year. So let's say it's a $2,000 apartment, down 9%. That's what, like almost 1,800 down from 2,000. That's a pretty big difference. I mean, in the grand scheme of things, it's not that big of a difference, but it does make a difference when you consider that the price of rent has been going up way faster than wages have at a very accelerated pace for a long time. So that actually is a lot. For me, it's unclear if this is a broader trend in other US cities. I can't imagine it's just a San Francisco, New York City thing. Coronavirus is already compounding on the already currently existing trend in the US, where people are moving to more suburban cities in the South, like South Carolina, Florida, Texas, as well as small and suburban cities in the Mountain West, like in Idaho or Colorado, Arizona, places like that. So my point being is there's just a lot of moving around, even if it's not related to COVID. The causes for people moving around are being accelerated by COVID. And I do have some other stories from other countries about covexoduses as well. Science magazine published an article about an exodus of the working poor in major Indian cities like Mumbai and New Delhi. I'm sure there's a lot more. Those are just the two that apply most to this. So a lot of the largest Indian cities depend on migrant labor. I kind of mentioned this with Dhaka, although they're not really migrants because they're in the country. In Bangladesh, most of the workers are domestic that then go to the city. In India, that's not always the case. The workers could come from more rural parts of India, but there's also a lot of workers from other countries. So the working poor in the biggest Indian cities were suffering the worst, with the Indian government restricting their ability to move stopping trains. This led to multiple labor strikes and protests. And after the Modi administration failed at providing workers with basically any resources, they began organizing buses and other forms of transportation out of the cities, specifically for migrant workers. In other words, the city wasn't giving any of these migrant workers resources, so they're like, screw this, we're gonna go back to our families out in the villages we come from. And the Modi administration said, no, you're actually gonna stay here and we're gonna cancel the trains. And so they protest, and we're like, well, give us something to help. And the Modi administration said, no, actually, we're going to force you to go back to your families now. If you're not just going to work, then screw it, go home. And so while having migrant urban poor workers go back to their home villages has alleviated some tensions regarding COVID, it has created problems elsewhere. For example, Science Magazine writes, quote, "The big question now is whether the destination states can deal with the expected rise in cases. The state of Bihar, for instance, which has lower than average numbers of medical facilities and healthcare personnel, has already received 500,000 people and is braced for another 500,000 in the coming days," end quote. Also, Israel's leading demographer, a professor named Sergio Della Pergola, warns that there could be a post-COVID-19 exodus by young, educated Israelis. He says that high unemployment mixed with political unrest will likely contribute to people leaving the country, and then on top of high unemployment and the political unrest, you add coronavirus, and it's just, yeah. So Professor Della Pergola seemed particularly alarmed.
I don't hear an alarm. Let's take stuff.
That these factors would negatively impact Jewish immigration to the state of Israel from other countries. He says immigrants from Russia, Argentina, and Mexico tend to move to Israel due to unemployment rates in their home country, but if there's unemployment issues in Israel, it will strongly decrease the amount of Jewish immigration to Israel. And finally, just to let you know that this is in fact a global trend that is highly related to coronavirus, but not necessarily. This one's not even unemployment related, but before coronavirus even started getting bad, there was, of course, Brexit going on. After Brexit, several large companies began moving staff out of the UK and into continental Europe. This was causing an exodus from London and some of the other major British cities. However, they moved to European cities that often already had issues with sky-high rent, gentrification, and overcrowding from tourists, like Paris, Amsterdam, some German cities, Frankfurt, I'm assuming, is one of the main ones. They all have issues with rent, gentrification, overcrowding. Amsterdam, in particular, actually has a really terrible tourist problem in the sense that a lot of day-to-day stuff isn't able to function because of the mass amount of tourists. Ultimately, I'm not sure what all this will amount to, but it does seem like exoduses from major cities and also maybe overcrowding of other cities is a growing trend. I think it's growing because the conditions that enabled these moves to begin with haven't been alleviated. They've actually been made worse by coronavirus. There's still a shortage of jobs in many parts of the world, And a lot of these jobs just honestly will probably not be coming back. A lot of them will come back. A lot of them probably won't. And so I think this is a time where there's going to be a lot of people moving around for a lot of different reasons. So I'll keep my eye on that.